Okay, so thanks everybody for gathering. This is Facing Hard Questions session number 13. And the topic is a subject called Supersessionism. That is a fancy theological term that is discussed often in theology departments and Bible departments, colleges and seminaries. It's not something that I know that the average Christian thinks about a lot. I could be wrong. Correct me if you've heard this before and this is something that you've thought about a lot before. But I do believe it has some very, very significant impacts on the world we live in, and particularly how we see ourselves related to the Jewish people. Right. So before I explain what supersessionism is, let me kind of remind you where we are in the Story of the Bible series, because this all relates, right? So in the Story of the Bible series, we've been talking about the exile and how devastating that was, right? God had made these promises to David about the people being able to live in the land and have a descendant of David always on the throne, and have the temple be this permanent place where God's name would dwell. And it seemed when the Babylonians came through and conquered the people that all of those promises were just undone, that they were, that God didn't follow through. Now you could, of course, make, there are a lot of different ways to deal with that. You could say, well, the people broke it on their end first, or you could say that, well, no, God hadn't given up on these aspirations. It was going through a low point, or maybe we're interpreting them wrong. But however you view it, this was a crisis. Like the Jewish people had to redefine, had to think about, okay, what does this mean? Like that God, that these promises that were given to David didn't seem to be kept in the way that people expected them to be kept. This is also a significant question for Christians, but in a slightly different way. It's significant for Christians in terms of how we see the Old Testament as being connected to the New. Because in the New Testament makes a pretty consistent and explicit claim that the followers of Jesus are the people of God. That this idea of the chosen people, language that's specifically drawn from the Old Testament that talks about us being set apart and holy and a priestly nation, that language is appropriated for the community of people who have chosen to follow Jesus, which is called the church. And that is regardless of whether you are a Jew or not, right? So let me just give one example of where this kind of comes out. From 1 Peter chapter 2, there's the passage starts talking about Jesus by saying, "Come to him, a living stone, though rejected by mortals, yet chosen and precious in God's sight. And like living stones, let yourselves be built into a spiritual house, to be a holy priesthood, to offer spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God through Jesus Christ. For it stands in Scripture, see, I'm laying in Zion a stone, a cornerstone, chosen and precious, and whoever believes in him will not be put to shame. To you then who believe, he's precious. But for those who do not believe, the stone that the builders rejected has become the very head of the corner, and a stone that makes them stumble, and a rock that makes them fall. They stumble because they disobey the word, as they were destined to do. But you are a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, God's own people, in order that you may proclaim the mighty acts of the one who called you out of darkness and into God's marvelous light. Once you were not a people, but now you are God's people. Once you had not received mercy, but now you have received mercy." Now, there's a lot of moves, interpretive moves going on in this passage. Peter is taking the language in the Older Testament that talks about the Jews being the chosen people, the people of God, and is making the argument that no, it's not just anybody who happens to be a descendant of Israel, but it's people who believe in Jesus. Yes, it's based on somebody who came to Zion, Jesus, but that's not how the people are defined now. But Christians also claim that the Old Testament, or the Older Testament, as I often say, is a part of our scriptural canon. We hold it to be authoritative and inspired and true. And in that testament, it is the case that in order to be a member of the people of God, it was defined primarily by, we might say biology, but probably a better way to say it would be your inherited status as a part of the Israelite community, right? So if you were an Israelite, whether you were faithful or not, whether you worshiped Yahweh properly or not, you were a part of God's people, God's chosen people. And thus God could get really frustrated with you because as God's chosen people, you weren't doing what you were supposed to be doing, but just because you disobeyed or you didn't believe or whatever, it didn't revoke that status from you, right? Because your ancestors, David and Abraham, were the ones to whom God had promised, your descendants shall be my people. So the question that Christians have to ask is, what happened between the Old Testament and the New Testament, in which being a part of the people of God in the Older Testament was primarily being a part of the community that descended directly, biologically, from Jacob, whose name was also Israel, right? So you're Israelite. Whereas in the New Testament, being a part of God's people means believing in Jesus. Why did that change? And so before I say any more about this, I'd just be interested in hearing your thoughts on it. What do you think? What happened there? Why does the Bible change the way that it talks about the people of God? Or maybe I'm mischaracterizing it in the way that I describe it. How do you make sense of this? Was it only a matter of biology or ethnic identity before, whereas in the New Testament, it's a matter of belief and commitment?
I actually have to question your comment that it's a matter of ethnicity or biology, because way back at the Exodus, they brought along a bunch of other people with them. Mm-hmm. So already at that point, you're not dealing with one biological stream anymore. But I'll let others speak about other things. But what translation were you reading from?
I think that was NRSV from first.
I particularly dislike the phrase chosen race.
Yeah.
Which in NIV is a chosen people, which I find more palatable. But
yeah, race is. But we're going to talk about that actually, because there are some prominent African American theologians who make the argument that the concept of racism actually emerges as a result of this theological thread. But yes, that's a fair thing to point out, that's a loaded term, and it's probably not, when they are talking about whatever that word was, they're probably not thinking all the things that we think when we hear the word race.
Cortland just pointed out that there are instances in the Old Testament about people converting to Judaism. So Rahab converting the people and so forth.
And so, that's why I wanted to offer kind of a qualified statement. Undoubtedly, there was a possibility from the beginning that you could be grafted into the Israelite community. But the expectation was that you would adopt Jewish practices and cultures. You would, if you were a male, you would be circumcised, or male or female, you would have any descendants circumcised. You would adopt Jewish food customs, and ultimately you would kind of give up, you would become a part of the Jewish community. And so, yes, there was a way for people who were not born as Israelites to integrate into that community. But the ethnic kind of basis or makeup of that community was still kept intact, and was the primary group that you had to join in order to be considered part of God's people. And in the New Testament, that's not the case. You can be a Greek who is not circumcised and is not eating kosher food and is not celebrating Jewish holidays, but who nonetheless, in fact, who doesn't interact with any Jews at all, but who nonetheless is considered a full member of the people of God. So what accounts for that change?
Then I have to question you, because in the first part of the New Testament, all of Jesus' followers are Jews, just about, and it isn't until the church makes a decision that it's okay for Gentiles to be, as you said, grafted in, that those things become true. That the church feels that, with the power of the Holy Spirit, they feel that they have that an opening has been made for Gentiles to come into the family tree, be grafted in.
So you don't think there's really a difference between how the Old Testament and the New Testament understands the people of God?
I think it took time, and I don't think it's Old Testament and New Testament. I think at the beginning of the Old Testament, at the beginning of the New Testament, everything's the same as it had been. And then I think, as the story develops, you've got various people having these different experiences. Philip baptizing the eunuch, and Jesus dealing with centurions and so forth, and finally Peter's big vision of the sheep coming down from heaven, and his encounter with Cornelius. And then he takes that back to the church, and the church says, whoa, what do we do with this? And makes an enormous decision about what that means, about the role of Gentiles in the early church. And then, Paul takes off, and the Gentiles, and Jerusalem is destroyed along with the temple, and Jewish leaders scattered, and then the Gentile branch takes off in such a crazy way that it knocks the whole tree off balance, and shatters it eventually, so that we now have this split between Christians and Jews that has led to all kinds of sin on the part of Christians.
So maybe I'll frame it this way then. Why did God choose at the moment when Peter, at the moment after the early church had formed and Jesus had risen from the dead, to reveal the vision at that moment that it was okay to eat meat and not follow the traditions, when that had definitely not been the case up to that point? Was it just that God was feeling spontaneous, and or if there's something that happened that accounted for that change?
I would again argue that the vision goes way back to, you can take it to creation if you want, or you can take it to Genesis 12, where you have God saying, I'm going to bless all nations through you, and that this was part of that process.
Okay.
Of the understanding that there's one God being spread out to the nations who hadn't had that understanding. But there's all these, Isaiah's full of, people from all over the world coming to the mountain of God and being taught, and Now I've
So
said,
Martha's not taking the bait.
somebody else.
She's not willing to acknowledge that there might be a distinction between the way that the Old Testament and the New Testament frames the understanding that people got. What what do the rest of you think? I got it. I can see that I'm not going to win this debate. What do the rest of you think? Is this something you've put thought into about what may have changed that made the way that being a part of the people of God, the understanding of that changed so much, if it changed at all?
So from my limited historical understanding, I would say one thing that definitely seems different, and I don't know if we've outright said it today, is the following of the law. Like that would be a really big difference, like strict adherence to the law versus in the New Testament where it's like, let's just focus on salvation, and then the law kind of falls under that. And there definitely seems to be more of an expression of grace towards not following the law. Of course, then you can always reference Jesus' words that the law was made for man and not the other way around. So a misunderstanding and a misinterpretation of what the law was supposed to do originally. But I definitely see maybe that big difference. And my one of my brothers has recently gotten into or started learning more about like the whole like Black Hebrew, Black Israelite. I don't know if it's fair to say movement or faction or however you want to frame it. But he very much, some of what he has been learning has been this idea that like all people are descendants of the original 12 tribes biologically. And like there would be absolutely zero way into heaven if we didn't have some kind of biological connection to the original 12 tribes.
I have some familiarity with this Black Hebrew movement, but I can't say that I'm an expert on it by any means. So that's interesting. I hadn't heard that before. And so if I won't push too hard like I was pushing Martha. But just one follow-up question is, I agree with you that there seems to be this big difference in terms of the law, in particular, in terms of how much it's emphasized. Why do you think God seems to be insistent on that in the Older Testament and then not so much in the New Testament?
Personally, I've always sort of thought about it in terms of milk and meat. And early on, I feel like what seems logical to me is that he establishes the law the same reason we establish all this structure for children. We're learning, we need guidance. We don't really know what we're doing. We seem to be struggling with figuring out how to implement what he wants us to do. And so he gives us explicit guidelines to follow to help keep us on the straight and narrow. Whereas by the time Jesus comes around, this whole following God thing isn't exactly new to at least the Israelites, at least to the Jews. And so by this point, we should have matured a little bit in our understanding of how to implement those principles and values. And so I feel like there's more of that emphasis the second time around, particularly for Gentiles who didn't grow up with all those rules to begin with. To have to learn all the rules and then unlearn all the rules again could have been just even today, I see that being very overwhelming for people.
Yeah. That's very helpful. And we'll call this the milk and meat model, but very well put. So that's good. Are there any others who have thought about this differently or not really thought about it much at all or been puzzled by it? Perhaps this expresses itself in a different way for you. Perhaps it's not that you wonder about why there was a change, but the whole Old Testament system just doesn't make sense to you at all, right? Like if it's always been about having faith in God and in Jesus, then what was all this about in the Old Testament, right?
Well, I've never thought about it, but I guess when you use, what is it, supersession? Is that the term?
Supersessionism, yeah. I'll get there very shortly.
I had
Yeah.
never, I mean, I'd never had any concept of that before, or criticism or whatever. But when you started mentioning it and what it was about, it just like, well, that's what I was always taught. I mean, that
Uh-huh.
the Old Testament, the Jews sort of didn't quite get it right. And,
Yes.
and Jesus is the whole picture, and Jesus got it right. And so, yeah, I've just assumed that was all correct, I guess, because never,
Yes.
I never really questioned it. It was just part of what I was taught or absorbed or something.
Thank you. Yes, yes. Thanks for having the courage to say that. I'm not saying that I agree with that view. I'm saying that that is exactly what supersessionism is, right?
Yeah.
It's the idea that God gave the Jews a particular way to try to be the people of God. They failed, and therefore God changed the game plan and went with Jesus. That's perhaps the most blunt version of it. There are softer versions of it, but yeah. Well, I'll just say a little bit more, but anybody please feel free to jump in. I know that this isn't a very familiar concept for a lot of folks, but it is a very consequential one. So, so I'll just start by saying, so supersessionism, the way that supersessionism is a way of interpreting the Bible story, right? And so this is something that we have to be very careful about. The reason I'm mentioning it now is because we are at the point in the Bible story where there seems to be this real shift in the relationship between God and the descendants of Israel. And how we interpret this shift has very big consequences. And I'd say probably the dominant interpretation for most of church history has been that God called the Jewish people to be the people of God, to live out this experiment in Israel. But at some point along the way, they didn't get it right. Whether it was a matter that they didn't get it right in those years leading up to the exile, and so God just let them be conquered, or if they didn't get it right sometime during Jesus's day, or even in the New Testament, because they didn't accept Jesus as their Messiah. But however you frame it, the idea is that they didn't get it right, and so God ends that covenant and starts a new covenant with Jesus and anybody who believes in Jesus, regardless of your cultural practices or anything like that. And people draw from a lot of New Testament scriptures to make this point. So, for example, there's this quote from Acts. I want to read a passage from Acts chapter 13. This is verses 44 through 46. This is reporting at a particular moment when Paul and Barnabas are just beginning to preach the gospel to Gentiles instead of Jews. It says, the next Sabbath, almost the whole city of Antioch, I believe, gathered to hear the word of the Lord. But when the Jews saw the crowds, they were filled with jealousy. So remember, Antioch is not a primarily Jewish city. There's a Jewish population there, but they're not the majority, as opposed to most of the places where Jesus lived at the top. Anyway, so when the Jews saw the crowds, they were filled with jealousy. And blaspheming, they contradicted what was spoken by Paul. Then both Paul and Barnabas spoke out boldly, saying, it was necessary that the word of God should be spoken first to you. Since you reject it and judge yourselves to be unworthy of eternal life, we are now turning to the Gentiles. So people have drawn on language like that and have taken it to mean that maybe even in the New Testament, God would have continued making the people of Israel the vehicle for salvation, but they just weren't listening. Some were, of course, but the majority weren't listening, and so God decided, we'll just extend this thing to the Gentiles. That is sometimes called replacement theology as well. Supersessionism means that this covenant superseded. Now, there is a softer version of this same thing, which is similar to what Corlin described, I think, as a kind of a meat and milk theology. And in this softer version, the idea is not that the Jewish people did anything wrong, but when Jesus came, Jesus revealed a fuller, more enlightened vision of God, and then kind of all of the Jewish practices became more irrelevant. And so I want to read a passage from Hebrews chapter 8 that seems to take on a perspective like this. It says, this is verses 6 through 11, "But Jesus has now obtained a more excellent ministry. And to the degree that he is the mediator of a better covenant, which has been enacted through better promises, For if that first covenant had been faultless, there wouldn't have been any need for a second one. But God finds fault with the people when he says, 'The days are surely coming, declares the Lord, when I will establish a new covenant with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah. Not like the covenant I made with their ancestors on the day when I took them by the hand to lead them out of the land of Egypt, for they did not continue in my covenant, and so I have no concern for them, says the Lord. This is the covenant I will make with the house of Israel at that time. I will put my laws in their minds and write them on their hearts, and I shall be their God, and they shall be my people.'" It goes on a little bit. This is quoting from Jeremiah. And then the author of Hebrews makes this final comment. "In speaking of a new covenant, God has made the first one obsolete. And what is obsolete and growing old will soon disappear." So in other words, maybe the covenant with David, with Abraham, had some value at the time, but it has been surpassed by a better covenant with Jesus. And so we don't really need to pay as much attention to that. And I'm afraid to say that even the language that we use to describe our own Bible is drawn heavily from these concepts, right? The word testament, when we talk about the New Testament and the Old Testament, actually means covenant. And so when you talk about the Old Testament, it means that you're referring to the Old Covenant. And if you have the way that Hebrews talks about old going on in your mind, then that seems to suggest that the Old Covenant, that the whole Old Testament is obsolete, as opposed to the New Covenant or the New Testament, which is relevant. This is one of the reasons why I make an effort, but I don't always succeed, as referring to the Old Testament as the Older Testament. I think it takes some of the edge off of that. And you'll find a lot of other people who use different language about that too. Sabrina will sometimes refer to it, for example, as the First Testament, or people will sometimes call it the Hebrew Scriptures. And that's all with this supersessionism debate going on in our minds. And I'd say that there are pros and cons to each of the terms that people use to describe it. But anyway, so you've got replacement theology, which says that, the Jews messed up, and so God expands it to Gentiles. Fulfillment theology, or this milk and meat theology, which says, well, Jesus gave a fuller account of God's will than the people had before, so we don't really need to pay as much attention. But the consequence of both of these is that the authority, the moral weight, the significance of the Older Testament is diminished, right? Like, maybe we don't need it for one reason or another. But what do you think? Do you buy this? Is this how do you rate the authority of the New Testament in comparison with the Old?
There's another whole category of consequence, which has to do with how Christians have treated Jews through the centuries.
Yes, I want to get there. Yes,
Okay.
yes. You can say something though. You can. I mean, that's
Well,
my
I
next
think,
talking point. But go
yeah,
ahead.
I think, what some Christians have thought is, okay, we're the people of God. God rejected the Jews, and so we should reject them too. And, the history of Europe is full of the history of persecution and expulsion and restrictions and pogroms and, of Christians failing to show any kind of grace or mercy to the Jewish communities that lived among them. So it's not just sort of a hypothetical thing. That's why it's important.
Yes, thank you. And since you brought it up, I want to spend a little bit more time elaborating on some of what you said there too. So Martha's right. There's this unfortunate dynamic that occurred where, eventually, when Christianity was first spreading in the Roman world, which included Israel at that point in history, the majority of people who were converting to it were converting from paganism, from these beliefs in various gods or whatnot. But eventually, Christianity converted almost everyone in Europe. There are a few exceptions here or there, but in the High Middle Ages, almost everyone in Europe is Christian, with the exception of Jewish communities. The Jewish communities held on because there were many Jews who said, we don't buy it. Like, we don't think that Jesus was this promised Messiah. This doesn't make sense to us. Now, this is especially true in places whose history we hear about the most, like France and England. There's a little bit more religious diversity in places like Spain and Austria and some of the northern countries. But anyway, in these places, of course, they didn't have modern science or whatnot, and when they'd experience something unexpected, like a plague or a disease comes through or a natural disaster, they would often wonder, well, what's going on? And they would see among them this community that in their mind had chosen not to accept God's new covenant. And in particular, there's another verse that often gets cited, which I'm going to read here with some sensitivity, that comes from Matthew 27, right? So this is the exchange that goes on between some of the chief priests in the crowds when Jesus is about to be crucified. It says, now the chief priests and the elders persuaded the crowds to ask for Barabbas and to have Jesus killed. The governor again said to them, which of these two do you want me to release for you? And they said, Barabbas. Pilate said to them, then what should I do with Jesus, who is called the Messiah? All of them said, let him be crucified. Then he asked, why? What evil has he done? But they shouted all the more, let him be crucified. So when Pilate saw that he could do nothing, but rather that a riot was beginning, he took some water and washed his hands before the crowd, saying, I am innocent of this man's blood. See to it yourselves. Then the people as a whole answered, his blood be on us and on our children. So he released Barabbas for them, and after flogging Jesus, he handed him over to be crucified. Now, this passage is a challenging one for a number of reasons, but let me just suggest how it has been taken by a number of Christians over time. People have interpreted it as, in this moment when Jesus was being crucified, it was Jewish people who both demanded it, caused it, and accepted responsibility on their race, on their ethnic community as a result of it. His blood be on our heads and on our children. And many of the people thought that meant, well, then not only are they rejecting God, they're cursed. They have this cursed status of being the ones responsible for killing God. And consequently, when people were in these middle-aged societies and they were trying to make sense of different tragedies or things that had happened, and they thought of these Jewish communities that had this curse upon them, they would rage against them for things that had nothing to do with anything that the Jewish folks had done. So there were acts of violence. There were situations where they were driven from cities and towns where they live. Pogroms is the term that is one of the terms that Martha used. This was something that happened all over Europe, especially in Russia is where the word comes from. There were legal legislative measures sometimes that were taken to exclude Jews from different lands. At one point, King Edward I of England passed a law that required all of the Jews who had been living in England to leave. Right? So there's this horrific persecution that occurs, and it occurs in relation to this theology, right? This theology that says the Jewish people failed. Not only did they fail, but they cursed Jesus, or they killed Jesus, and therefore we need to remove them from our society. Something that ultimately culminated in the Holocaust. And the Holocaust, it didn't quite have the same explicit religious rationale. I wouldn't suggest that the Nazis were Christians or were, deriving their persecution of the Jews from the Bible, but the general animosity was one that they had inherited from people who were interpreting the Jews through this particular biblical lens. So anyway, you might recall that, this is still a sensitive issue. You might recall that when the movie The Passion of the Christ came out several years ago, the movie was done in Latin and it was translated into whatever language at the bottom of the screen. And it included this line from the Jewish people that says, "Let his blood fall on us and our heads." And Jewish people around the world were very nervous that this could reignite anti-Semitism. And so as a compromise, the writers of the Passion left the line in there in Latin, but did not translate it into the different languages on the bottom of the screen.
So 3 years ago, we were in a Jewish settlement of Ephra, just south of Bethlehem. And the settler who spoke to us said at the beginning, "So I've researched Mennonites, and I know that you believe that Jews are responsible for the death of Jesus." Mm. I just stand up and say, I can't speak for all Mennonites, but I honestly think the notion that Jews today are responsible for the death of Jesus is abhorrent. Yeah. I've read, there's a Jewish New Testament scholar at Vanderbilt who tells stories about being a little girl on the school bus and other kids saying to her, "You killed Jesus." Mm. She didn't know who Jesus was, but apparently she was responsible for Jesus' death. So this is very much still current. Yeah.
Right. There's a few other not interesting, there's horrible, but so the school where I studied, Duke Divinity School, has a couple of very, very sharp Black theologians who have made the argument that racism, which was created in Europe, evolved out of medieval Europe, was actually a child of anti-Semitism, that this way of viewing a particular people as being cursed, like as a biological group, and that God might have a will for one people to dominate or cast out another, lent itself to interpreting other passages of the Bible and other peoples through similar lenses. And so this whole curse of Ham theology that we talked about, this bogus theology that people suggest that anyone of African descent is a descendant of Ham and they're therefore cursed, seems to have a very close relationship with this Jewish theology. All right, I'm sorry. I know this is a lot of talking, but I do want to pivot and note that there's another prominent view out there but it doesn't necessarily make things easier, right? So there's another perspective out there that's called dual covenant theology. And this perspective is one that suggests that, okay, God made a covenant with the Jews in the Old Testament. We consider this to be a part of our scriptures. And we see God seems to make this covenant in the New Testament for Gentile people, that as long as they believe in Jesus, they can be saved. Maybe there are two covenants, and both of these are true, that that the Jewish people will be saved as Jews, and the Gentile people have to believe in Jesus to be saved. And there's this a lot of this comes from a certain interpretation of Paul in Romans chapter 11, where Paul says, I want you to understand this mystery. Hardening has come upon part of Israel until the full number of Gentiles has come in. And so all Israel will be saved. As it is written, out of Zion will come the deliverer. He will banish ungodliness from Jacob. And this is my covenant with them when I take away their sins. As regards the gospel, they're enemies of God for your sake, but as regards election, they're beloved for the sake of their ancestors. For the gifts and the calling of God are irrevocable. Okay? So some people take this very fascinating, dense discussion that Paul has in Romans chapter 11 and say, there are these two covenants. The Jews will be saved as Jews, and everybody else, if they want to be saved, they have to be a Christian. And this is a relatively new interpretation, frankly, in world history. It came around late 1700s, early 1800s, around the same time as the dispensational movement, when people are thinking about the end times in new ways. And a part of this thinking suggested that in the end times, Israel will be able to regain control of the historic land of Israel, and that this will usher in the return of Christ. And all this, on the surface, this seems to be a view that's much less dangerous, because it doesn't have animosity toward Jewish people. This view, which has been embraced by a particular wing of evangelicals, has caused many evangelicals to give unconditional support to the people living in Israel today, saying that they have a right to drive the Palestinians and anyone else out of the land because God's covenant with them still holds true. And so when you see some of the things coming in current politics where, for example, Trump makes the move to recognize Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, at the prompting of evangelicals who take these very pro-Israelite stands. This is an outgrowth of a different way of trying to make sense of these two covenants, one that has consequences too. So I wonder, what do you think of this? Is this better? Is this something that makes sense to you, that there could be two separate covenants? Is there space for something in between these two extremes of, God rejected the one for the other, or, God is upholding both of them separately?
All this discussion, maybe it's because of one book I'm reading right now, or maybe it's from working 10 years with Aboriginal people, but it kind of makes me wonder what, like even this Zionist thing going on, with the possibility of being two covenants or whatever. Where do Christians get, like the story about somebody killing somebody with a turban on during the Crusades and saying, finding out he was a Christian and saying, oh my God, he had a turban on, how, or the Native Americans weren't even people, so they could just be killed. You could do whatever you wanted to with them. So it seems like, there could be a couple of covenants, but where out of Christianity do you get these other things as well that would almost say we've got a connection with God, but anybody who doesn't agree with that or whatever, doesn't think the same way we do, they don't, and we can do whatever we want.
Right. I mean, that's absolutely relevant to the discussion in a broader sense. How a number of folks, when you interpret yourselves as being the God's elect, that tends to have a consequence in history where it makes you feel that you have the right to do what you want to other people because your desires and your plans are divinely ordered and theirs are not. And so you're right. I mean, like, in addition to however we see what's happening with Jews, this has had consequences for how Americans who saw themselves as the chosen people treat, or I should say, European colonists who saw themselves as the chosen people treated Native Americans. It has had impacts all over the world. So yeah, that's this chosen people stuff is how we interpret it is very important. So we have to tread carefully when we're thinking about this. That being said, I would also say that in my own theology, this concept of being a chosen people is extraordinarily important, and I'm not willing to let go of it. Like I've come to believe that the church is a chosen people, that we have a revelation that the rest of the world doesn't have, that we have a special role in society. But we have to be very careful about what we think that means if we're going to make those kinds of claims, because historically they have had horrific consequences on peoples all around the world when interpreted poorly, I might add. Okay, feel free to jump in. I'm sorry, maybe this isn't something you all have thought about as much, so so we don't have the same number of questions or whatnot, except perhaps Martha, who wrote a paper about it apparently when I was still in elementary school. But I do want to go back to this. The truth is that what Martha is suggesting is actually very close to what I believe myself, and I was pushing her for the sake of getting conversation going. But the way that I try to, in my own mind, create a middle space between these, what I see as dangerous extreme views, is to suggest that, is to remember that the church is not something separate that was created, but it was birthed out of Israel, right? Jesus and all of his followers were Jewish. And so this is a Jewish movement. Christianity is a Jewish movement, a Jewish religion that made the choice at some point along the way, or whom God inspired at some point along the way, to allow other peoples to be grafted in or to be included as a part of that community, without fully embracing all of the cultural practices that had been important to Jewish people in the past. But that it's still at its core is fundamentally Jewish. And I'll just say that I think that this would have been more obvious to Christians were it not for another tragedy that most people don't know about, right? So in the early days of Christianity, Jerusalem was one of the hubs, was one of the leading centers of Christian thought and decision-making for a very long time, right? At least in the New Testament period, in Acts, there's this sense that if Christians are going to make a agreed upon change church-wide about what it means to be a Christian, it has to be affirmed by the church in Jerusalem. So it had this kind of this primacy as the place from which Christianity was born. And for centuries, the bishop, the leader of the church in Jerusalem, was Jewish. And so that meant whenever there were these theological discussions going around in the church, including some early theological discussions about whether we should get rid of the Old Testament at all or not, they had to contend with these very prominent Christian figures based in Jerusalem, these very prominent bishops and figures who could say, no, this does not line up with what Jesus taught. And we should know because he preached and died and rose from the dead here, right? Like this is where it happened. But unfortunately, there was this dynamic happening with the Romans. So the Romans had a series of 3 different wars with the Jewish people subsequent to Jesus' death and resurrection. The first one, the one that most people know about, happened in 70 AD when a Roman general, Vespasian, I think, I haven't looked it up recently, but came through and destroyed the city of Jerusalem, right? Destroyed the temple of Jerusalem, and the temple has never been rebuilt from that moment all the way to the present day. And that was certainly a tragic point, but it wasn't the end of it. The Jewish people continued to live in Jerusalem and in Judea for centuries to come. But at the end of the Third War, in the 200s, between the Jews and the Romans, the Romans made an edict that said, you know what, they thought like the Babylonians, as long as the people are attached to this land, they're going to keep rebelling against us. So they forced all of the Jewish people to leave the province of Judea. They literally drove them out. They deported them. And after that, there was still a church in Jerusalem, but there's a switch, and all of its bishops prior to that were Jewish, and all of its bishops following that were Gentiles. And so there was no longer a prominent Jewish voice in leadership. And it was also around that time that the church in Rome began making these claims of primacy, that the capital of Christianity, or whatever, the center of Christianity, isn't in Jerusalem. The center of Christianity is in Rome. And I think that this was a tragic change, not only because of the impact that it had on the Jewish people at that time, but also because we lost the sense after that Christianity was really an outgrowth of out of Judaism. So anyway, sorry, bore you with probably some unnecessary history there, but I think that helps explain how this anti-Semitism began to develop. Okay, anybody have any comments, feedback, thoughts that don't relate to any of this that have been swirling around in your head about anti-Semitism and how we interpret?
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. Mm-hmm.
Okay. So I think what's making me so intrigued about the Franciscan theology, where Christ's birth and just his presence becomes central, so that it includes everybody. It doesn't just include, well, actually it includes the whole world. It's the emphasis of, well, God created this, and so the creation becomes a sense of, well, we have to treat creation right, and we have to treat all races and people the same, because we're all in the image of God. And there's a big difference between the kind of the Franciscan idea of when salvation started versus how we see maybe salvation in terms of the cross. And that shifts the focus from, well, one person is special, we're all in this together, at least for me.
Yeah, and I mean, I'd say that generally I agree with that principle, that your race, your ethnic background doesn't have any bearing on whether God accepts you or loves you, or whether you could be a full member of the people of God. Except that the question remains, what does that mean for the Jewish people who have not converted to Christianity? And in the minds of a lot of folks, the fact that Jewish people have not all, but most Jewish people have not seen from their scriptures that Jesus is the Messiah and they should follow Jesus. When they were more equipped to do so based on having those scriptures or whatever, suggests that they were, there's something particularly sinister about their rejection of Christianity as opposed to just people who'd never heard of it, for example. And so that's, I mean, I think that's where we have to be really careful. And it's really a big question mark that, that in my mind, I don't even know that I have fully resolved, is for the Jewish people, the many Jewish people in the world today who have much of the same theological history that we claim, what kind of relationship do they have with God still? Is it still a special kind of relationship? And then what kind of relationship does that mean that we, who have accepted many of their scriptures and claimed to follow Messiah from their tradition, where does that leave us with them? Right?
So we have another hour?
No,
I'm
probably.
not.
I think that Paul's image of being grafted into the tree is important. There have been Christian interpreters who have said, oh, the tree was dying, and so God had to graft the new branches on to make it grow. Well, that's not how grafting works. You have to have a healthy rootstock or nothing is going to grow on it. So he's not saying that the rootstock was dead or it would have been no point in grafting. I mean,
Yeah.
some of these interpreters don't know anything about grafting, but I just think we have to search for ways of thinking and for theologies that allow that image to hold true. That
Yeah.
we're grafted into Judaism and not the tree doesn't become peripheral just because we're there.
Mm-hmm.
But I think I found, 9 different ways that scholars tried to put this together.
Interesting.
And I was wrong. The paper was only in 2007, so you were already in college. But, like those who are hostile to Judaism, those who are supersessionists but are friendly to Judaism, those who are just looking, like you said, dispensationally at the end times and imagining that the Jews are going to come back and then all have a mass conversion, and this 2 covenant view, and I don't know that there's an answer. I don't think, of course you can have universalism and you can just say everybody's going to be saved eventually, and then that takes care of it. But then you've got some trouble with some other scriptures that seem to indicate otherwise. So I don't know an answer, but I think we have to kind of unlearn some of the suppositions that some of us have grown up with, because they're very much tied. My professor I took a class on dialogue between Jews and Christians, and professor kept saying over and over again, every one of the people who perpetrated the Holocaust was a baptized Christian. They might not have been doing it for Christian reasons, but they had been baptized when they were little, and they had at least considered themselves Christians for part of their lives. And this tree of anti-Semitism has been grown within Christianity for a long time and needs to be uprooted. Just to mix my metaphors a little.
It's very helpful.
I guess my question is, because if I heard you right, you were saying a while back about a lot of the evangelicals see it as 2 covenants and by raising that and putting it in that category, I'm trying to figure out what your critique, why is that a bad thing? Because my impression was that makes Christians value the Jews still and value the Old Testament, knowing we are part of, as Paul continues to point out, it was Abraham's faith that was rendered righteousness, and it's all about faith. But when you bring it up as hard questions, is it you see a problem with that?
I'm glad you brought that up. I did not do a very good job of fleshing out my thinking on that. Acknowledging that we're going into overtime here, so if anybody needs to leave,
I'm not driving now.
Feel free to do so. I see that, but yeah. So just to flesh this out a little bit more, this idea that the Jews would have a special role in the end times, and so God has a different kind of planned track for them than God has for the rest of the other chosen people, Christians, influenced what happened after World War II, right? So there was this Holocaust after World War II, and there was this widespread acknowledgement that, Jewish people needed to have a safe space that they could call as a country of their own, and where to do that. And there were these, different ideas that floated around out there. But this idea that many Christians had, combined with a similar theology that was developing among Jews at the same time, that the Jews were supposed to retake the land of Israel, helped prompt the decision that they should be moved back into Canaan. We would give that to them. We'll make that their country. The problem is there were already other people living there, people who had lived there for hundreds of years, the Palestinians, right? And so when the Jewish people, when this was granted, when this kind of space was decided by the nations of the world to be a space for the nation of Israel, thousands upon thousands of Palestinian people were driven from their homes. They became homeless. They suffered persecution. And among those who stayed, who continued to live in that land, they essentially lost authority and political status over them. And from that time until the present one, the nation of Israel has been systematically trying to pressure them or remove them or give them secondary status so that they can have complete control of Israel as a Jewish state. So there are these settlements, for example, of Palestinians, even though this is recognized as a land of Israel, and Jewish people have
Israelis.
Yeah, go ahead, Martha. You know this history better than me.
Not settlements of Palestinians, settlements of Jewish settlers within Palestine.
Thank you. Yes, that's right. So there's some territory within what we think of as the historic land of Israel that belongs to Palestinians. They don't have authority over it. But the Jewish state is has been encouraging Jewish people to move into that land and essentially then claim that that's part of their territory to kick people out. And so there's just all these horrific persecutions that have happened in the past half century, more than that now, 75 years since against the Palestinians, but evangelicals tend to give Israel unconditional support in what it does, regardless of the human rights abuses or the harm to this Palestinian community, because they believe that the Israelites are divinely ordained to retake this land in order to fulfill the end times or whatever. And so it's not that the theology is harmful to the Jews. It's not. You're right. I mean, it's a weird switch where conservative Christians for centuries have been persecuting Jews and their theology, and all of a sudden there's this just kind of unconditional support, but it ends up harming other people as a result, if that makes sense.
And Christians in Bethlehem, for example, have been told that they aren't really Christians because they don't believe in Zionism, in Christian Zionism. What I'm noticing is that your account sounds a whole lot like, King George handing out swaths of North America to people to settle it and push out the current inhabitants.
Yeah. Yep. Ouch. Yeah. Yeah, this is another whole discussion, but this is a very common strategy. I mean, Russia also is doing it all the time to try to expand its territorial claims, where a government of a people, like the Russians or the Jews or whatever, will encourage their people to move slightly outside of their territorial borders. And then they make the additional claim that, well, we have to protect them because they're part of our people, right? So this is how you, and Martha is pointing out that this may have had something to do with the formation of the United States of America, which is not a comfortable claim.
Okay.
Okay, that was a lot, but thank you for bearing with me. Let's hope that as we move into the New Testament and we hold on to this idea, which I see as being central to the Bible story, that there is a chosen people who has a special role, a special revelation from God to give to the world, that we can do so in a way that does not give anyone a blank check to harm others in order to accomplish God's will, and that certainly does not denigrate the Jewish people for not interpreting it in the same way that we do. So, thanks.